My sister was the golden child and my parents paid for everything. But when they demanded I give her my $9,000, I saved working 2 years or get kicked out. I exposed them on Facebook and discovered it was all a lie. They'll never forget. I'm 18 years old, just graduated high school about 3 months ago. And I need to tell this story because what happened basically destroyed my relationship with my parents and almost ruined the one I had with my sister. The thing is, my whole life, for as long as I can remember, I always knew Hannah was the favorite. It's not like my parents were horrible to me or anything, but it was just obvious, you know? She was 4 years older than me, and everything she did was perfect. She got good grades, was popular, had tons of friends. I was the younger brother who basically existed in the background. When I was about 14, Hannah left for college. My parents, Timothy, and Donna, paid for everything. And when I say everything, I mean absolutely everything. Tuition, housing, books, food, even a new car so she could come and go. My dad back then had a good job in finance or something like that. I don't remember exactly what he did, but he made good money, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. We lived in a nice house in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other, like one of those places where neighbors wave at you when you go out to walk the dog. Truth is, we had a comfortable life. We weren't rich or anything, but we didn't lack anything either. When I was 16, I got my first job at a fast food restaurant. I made like $8 an hour, worked after school and on weekends. My parents told me it was a good idea for me to learn the value of money, to build character and stuff like that. The funny thing is, Hannah never had to work during high school, but whatever. I didn't complain. I started saving everything I earned because I knew I was eventually going to need it for college. I opened a savings account and basically didn't spend anything except on absolute necessities. My friends would go out on Fridays to the movies or to get pizza, and I'd often say I couldn't because I wanted to save. Sounds kind of sad now that I think about it. But at the time, I felt proud of myself. Like, look how responsible I am. Everything changed when COVID hit in 2020. I was 17. In my senior year of high school, my dad decided, and I still don't really understand why, that he was going to quit his job and start his own business. Something related to consulting, I think. The timing couldn't have been worse. He literally started right when everything shut down. At first, my parents acted like everything was fine, like it was just temporary, you know. They'd say things like, "It's just a matter of time until things go back to normal," and "The business is going to take off, we just have to be patient." But I noticed things. They started buying generic brands at the supermarket instead of the usual ones. We stopped going out to dinner on Sundays like we used to. My mom started talking about adjusting the budget every other minute. Hannah graduated from college in May 2021. In the middle of the pandemic, she got a decent job in her field. Don't ask me exactly what she did, because I never paid much attention when she talked about it, but I know she made enough to live on her own. She moved to an apartment like an hour away from us. My parents were super proud, obviously. My mom wouldn't stop talking to the neighbors about how Hannah was so successful and responsible. I kept working. I'd switched from the restaurant to a job at an electronics store that paid a little better, like $11 an hour. And by the time I graduated in June 2022, I had saved almost $9,000. It might not sound like much, but for me it was a fortune. I had literally worked 2 years straight, barely spending anything to save that money. The plan was to go to a state university, nothing fancy but a good school, and use my savings to supplement whatever scholarships and student loans I could get. My parents had never explicitly told me they weren't going to pay for my college like they had for Hannah, but I wasn't an idiot either. I could see how things were, financially, and I knew I'd probably have to manage on my own. And I was okay with that, honestly. I felt good about being independent, about not having to depend on them. Then we got to July of last year. I had just turned 18, had just graduated about a month before. One night, my parents called me into the living room. They had those serious faces you make when you're about to talk about something important. I sat on the couch and my dad started talking. He told me Hannah was going through a tough time, that she'd had some unexpected expenses and couldn't afford to pay that month's rent. She needed $1,200. I think that's what she paid for rent. My dad explained that they didn't have that money available at the moment because the business was still struggling and they'd had to put all their savings into keeping it afloat. He looked at me directly and said, "We need you to give your sister the money from your savings account so she can pay her rent." I sat there trying to recorders, process what I'd just heard. Were they asking me to give my college money to my sister? My mom added that it was just a loan, that Hannah would pay me back as soon as she could, probably in a couple of months. I asked my dad why Hannah couldn't get a loan from a bank or use a credit card, and he told me her credit wasn't that good, which surprised me because I always thought she was perfect at everything, and that banks weren't going to give her a loan that quickly. I asked if they couldn't borrow from a relative, like my Uncle Harold, who's my dad's older brother and has always had money, but my dad got kind of uncomfortable and said he didn't want to involve more family in their financial problems. So I said no. I simply said no, that money was for my college and that I'd been saving it for 2 years. My mom got emotional, started with the whole speech about how family helps each other, that Hannah was my sister, and that I was being selfish by refusing to help her when she needed me. My dad was more direct, told me that as long as I lived under his roof, I had to contribute and help the family. I reminded him that Hannah never had to work during high school, that they paid for absolutely everything in college, and that it wasn't fair that now they were asking me to sacrifice my savings. My dad got really angry, turned red, and started yelling that the situation now was different, that things had changed, that I didn't understand how hard it was to support a family. The argument got worse and worse. I kept insisting I wasn't going to give my money to Hannah, that I'd worked too hard for that money and I needed it for my future. My mom was crying, saying I was a cruel and ungrateful son, that after everything they'd done for me, I couldn't make this small sacrifice for my sister. Small sacrifice, can you believe it? They were talking about $1,200 out of almost $9,000 I had saved. But for me, it was the principle of the thing, you know? If I gave them that money now, what was going to happen next? Were they going to ask me for more? And what guarantee did I have that Hannah was actually going to pay me back? Finally, my dad told me I had until the end of the day to decide. Either I gave them the money, or I could look for another place to live. I just stood there. Literally couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was he kicking me out of the house for not giving money to my sister? I asked him if he was serious, and he just repeated, "You have until 11 at night to decide." It was like 6 in the evening at that point. I went up to my room and closed the door. I sat on my bed and honestly didn't know what to do. I called a couple of friends, but none answered. It was Friday night, and they were probably busy. I started thinking about my options. I could give them the money, stay in the house, but lose an important part of my savings and basically give in to their blackmail. Or I could stand firm and risk being homeless. At 10:30 at night, I came downstairs with my backpack packed. I'd put in clothes, my laptop, some important documents like my birth certificate and social security card, basic stuff. My dad was in the living room watching TV. He saw me with the backpack and turned off the TV. He asked me what my decision was. I told him I wasn't going to give them the money. He got up from the couch and told me, "Then you have 10 minutes to get out of my house." My mom appeared from the kitchen and started crying again, saying she couldn't believe I was doing this, that I was choosing money over my family. I tried to explain that it wasn't about the money, it was about the principle, about the fact that they were treating me different from how they treated Hannah, but my dad just yelled, "I don't want to hear you. I don't want to see you again until you come to your senses and stop being so selfish." I left the house with my backpack and stood in the driveway not knowing what to do. It was almost 11 at night on a Friday. I considered going to a hotel, but didn't want to spend my money on that. Then, I remembered my Uncle Harold, my dad's brother. He and his wife Virginia lived about 20 minutes away. We'd never been super close, but they'd always been nice to me. I called them and Virginia answered. I explained what had happened, trying not to cry because I was still in shock, and she immediately told me to come over, that I could stay with them as long as I needed. I called an Uber, which cost me like $15. Remember, because it hurt to spend that money. And I got to their house around 11:30. Virginia opened the door and hugged me immediately. Harold was there too. He looked worried. They had me come in, gave me something to eat, even though I wasn't hungry, and let me use the guest room. Virginia told me to relax, that I could stay there all summer if I needed to. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation with my parents in my head, wondering if I'd done the right thing, if I should have just given them the money to avoid all this drama. But I was also furious, like, how dare they treat me like this? After 2 years of hard work, of sacrificing going out with my friends, of saving every penny, this is how they thanked me? The next day, Saturday morning, I was still lying in bed in the guest room when my cell phone started ringing. It was Hannah. I answered, and the first thing she said was, "What the fuck did you do?" She told me Mom had called her crying, telling her I'd refused to help her, and that now I was homeless because of my fault. I explained my version of the story, that Dad and Mom had asked me for my college money, that I'd said no, and that they'd kicked me out. Hannah was quiet for a moment, and then told me I was an idiot, that it was only $1,200, that she really needed the money, and that I was being incredibly selfish. I asked her why she couldn't borrow from a friend, or get the money another way, and she got even more upset, told me that wasn't my business, and that clearly I'd never loved her as a sister. She hung up before I could say anything else. I spent that whole weekend at my aunt and uncle's house, basically doing nothing but thinking. Harold talked to me Sunday afternoon. He asked me how I felt, and I told him confused, angry, betrayed. He told me he'd invested money in my dad's business, like $50,000, and that he knew things weren't going well. He told me he understood why I didn't want to give them my money, that I had every right to protect my savings, especially because I'd earned them with my own work. Virginia added that they supported me completely and that I shouldn't feel guilty for setting boundaries. Monday morning, I was still angry. Very angry, actually. And I think it was that anger that made me do something stupid. I opened Facebook, and well, here comes the part where I really screwed things up. I wrote a long post, and when I say long, I mean like full essay, explaining the whole situation. I talked about how I'd worked since I was 16 to save for college, how my parents had paid for everything for Hannah, but expected me to manage on my own, how they'd demanded I give my money to my sister, and how they'd kicked me out of the house when I refused. I mentioned that Dad's business was failing, that they were struggling financially. Basically, I aired all our dirty laundry in public. At the time, I felt justified. Like, I wanted people to know the truth. I wanted them to see that I wasn't the bad guy. The post exploded. Within hours, it had like 100 comments. Relatives, my parents' friends, neighbors, everyone giving their opinion. Most of the comments supported my decision, saying things like, "You did right to defend your savings, and your parents are wrong, and favoritism is toxic." But some comments also criticized my parents directly, saying they were bad parents. How dare they kick out their son, that they should be ashamed. There were people sharing the post, tagging more relatives. It was a total mess. I felt like, I don't know, like victorious in a way, because finally people were seeing my side of the story. But then my dad called me. He was furious, more furious than I'd ever heard him. He yelled at me about how dare I humiliate them publicly, that I'd embarrassed the family in front of everyone, that I'd shared private information about their finances. He demanded I delete the post immediately. My mom took the phone and was crying hysterically, saying people were calling her a bad mother, that the neighbors weren't talking to her anymore, that I'd ruined her reputation. I hung up the phone without deleting the post, but then I started receiving messages from other relatives. My aunt on Mom's side wrote me saying that, although she understood my frustration, making it public had been a mistake, that these matters should be handled privately. A cousin told me that my parents were definitely wrong, but that I'd also crossed a line by exposing them like that. Even Harold told me, very tactfully, that maybe I'd taken things too far. I started to feel guilty. I'd acted out of anger and had hurt my parents in a permanent way. Yes, they'd kicked me out, but I damaged their reputation in front of the whole community. By the end of Monday, I deleted the post. But the damage was already done. People had already seen it. Some had even taken screenshots. My dad sent me a text message saying he'd never forgive me for what I'd done, that I'd betrayed the family in the worst possible way. Hannah sent me a message full of insults, basically calling me everything, saying I was a horrible brother and she wished I'd never been born. That hurt more than I expected, honestly. Even though we were never super close, she was still my sister, and hearing that from her was like a punch in the gut. About 2 weeks passed. I was still at Harold and Virginia's house, looking for part-time jobs for the summer before starting college in August. One night, I was having dinner with them when Virginia mentioned something casually. She said she was glad Hannah had been able to resolve her rent problem. I sat there with my fork in my hand, confused, and asked her what she meant. Virginia looked at me surprised and said, "Well, Harold gave her the money for her rent like 2 weeks ago, didn't you know?" I turned to look at Harold and he confirmed, said my dad had asked him the favor and that he agreed because he didn't want Hannah to lose her apartment. I felt like someone had thrown a bucket of cold water over me. What? Harold had given Hannah the money? 2 weeks ago? That meant my parents had already solved the problem when they kicked me out. Harold saw my expression and realized I didn't know anything. He explained that my dad had called him that same Friday. I left the house, asking him to lend Hannah the money. Harold agreed, but told my dad that didn't mean what they were doing to me was right. My dad apparently assured him that I would come to my senses and that everything would be resolved. I couldn't believe it. My parents had kicked me out of the house, had made me feel like the worst person in the world, had allowed Hannah to insult and blame me, and all that time the money that was supposedly so urgent was already taken care of. Harold asked me if I was okay, and honestly, I didn't know how to answer. I was between disbelief and absolute rage. Virginia looked guilty, told me she assumed I knew, that she never imagined my parents hadn't told me. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking. Why had my parents done that? Was it just to teach me a lesson? To punish me for not obeying? The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. They'd manipulated me, basically. They'd made me believe Hannah was in a terrible crisis and that I was the only one who could help her, when in reality, they'd had a plan B all along. And they didn't. I even have the decency to tell me afterwards that they'd already solved the problem. I decided to call Hannah. It was like 1 a.m, but I didn't care. She answered, half asleep and annoyed. I asked her directly if she knew Harold had given her the money for her rent. She was quiet for a moment and then said yes, she knew. I asked her then why the fuck had she called me that Saturday to insult me and blame me when she already had the money taken care of. Hannah sighed and told me Mom had told her to call me, that they needed me to understand the consequences of my actions. I asked her what else she knew, if she was aware they'd kicked me out. She said yes, that Mom had told her everything. I yelled at her. So you knew I was basically homeless while you were calling me to treat me like garbage, knowing your problem was already solved? Hannah didn't say anything for several seconds. Then, her voice sounded different, like softer, and she told me, "Austin, I have to tell you something." She told me that during her 4 years of college, our parents didn't pay for everything like I thought. Yes, they paid for the first 2 years, but then the money started running out. By her 3rd year, Hannah had to take out student loans. By her last year, she was working part-time and struggling to pay her expenses because Dad and Mom couldn't help her anymore. She told me Virginia and Harold had secretly been giving her money during those last 2 years, paying for her university housing and some expenses. Our parents didn't want me to know they were having financial problems, so they made Hannah promise to keep everything secret. I stayed quiet, processing all this information. Hannah continued, told me that when our parents asked her to call me that Saturday to scold me, she did it because she thought I really was being selfish. Mom had told her I had thousands of dollars saved and didn't want to give a single penny to my own sister. She didn't mention they'd kicked me out or that Harold had already given her the money. Hannah thought it was simply a call to make me reconsider. When she found out later from the Facebook post about what had really happened, she felt horrible. But Mom convinced her that I'd exaggerated everything and that it was still my fault for not helping in the first place. I asked her why she hadn't reached out to me afterwards to tell me the truth. She told me she was afraid of going against our parents, that she'd already seen how they'd treated me and didn't want them to do the same to her. Plus, she said, Dad and Mom had been giving her money occasionally even after she graduated, small amounts to help her with expenses, and she didn't want to lose that help. Basically, she was afraid of being financially homeless if she took my side. We talked for like 2 hours that night. Hannah told me more things. Like throughout my childhood, Mom would tell her she had to be perfect because she was the older daughter and had to set an example. She told me that when I was born, Mom went through severe postpartum depression and that Dad had blamed Hannah, who was 4 years old at the time, for not helping enough with the baby. She told me that throughout high school, when I thought she was the favorite, she felt under horrible pressure to keep up appearances, to never fail, because she knew if she did, Dad and Mom would be terribly disappointed. She talked about how she'd also been manipulated and used in different ways over the years. By the end of the conversation, we were both crying. Hannah apologized for having treated me badly, for having allowed our parents to pit us against each other. She told me she'd also been a victim of the favoritism and manipulations, just in a different way than me. I told her I forgave her and apologized for the Facebook post, for having exposed things that also affected her. We agreed we needed to start over our relationship as siblings, without our parents' interference. After that call, I felt strange. On one hand, relieved that Hannah and I had finally understood each other, but on the other hand, devastated to realize how much our parents had manipulated both of us. We weren't fighting siblings because we really hated each other. We were distant siblings because our parents had used us as pawns in their own problems and dysfunctions. I tried to talk to my parents one more time, like at the beginning of August. I sent them a long text message explaining that I knew about Harold giving Hannah the money, that I knew they'd lied to me, and that I just wanted to understand why. My dad responded with a short message saying they didn't owe me any explanation, that I'd betrayed the family with my Facebook post, and that I'd made my choice the day I chose money over them. My mom sent me a separate message saying she was deeply hurt by my actions, that she didn't recognize the son she'd raised, and that she needed time to heal before she could talk to me. I left for college, at the end of August. I got a good scholarship, and between that and my savings, plus a small student loan, I was able to cover my first year. Harold and Virginia helped me move, bought me stuff for the dorm, basically acted like the parents my own parents decided to stop being. The day they left me on campus, Virginia hugged me and told me she was proud of me, that I'd shown more maturity and character in these last few months than many adults she knew. Harold gave me extra money, like $500, and told me if I ever needed anything not to hesitate to call them. Hannah visited me twice during my first semester. We went to dinner, walked around campus, talked about everything except our parents. We were rebuilding our relationship slowly, really getting to know each other for the first time. She told me about her job, her problems with her boss, a guy she liked. I told her about my classes, my new friends, how weird it was to live in a dorm. It was nice, like, we finally had a normal sibling relationship. In December, just before winter break, Hannah called me. She told me she'd cut off contact with our parents. Apparently, Dad had asked her for more money, like $3,000 this time, to invest in the business with the promise that he'd pay her back with interest. Hannah told him no, that she didn't have that money, and Dad got furious. He told her she was an ungrateful daughter, that after everything they'd done for her, the least she could do was help them now that they needed it. Hannah finally exploded and told him all the things she'd been holding in, how they'd manipulated her, how they'd put both of us in impossible situations, how they'd lied and played with our emotions. Dad hung up on her, and since then hasn't answered her calls or messages. I didn't spend winter break at home. I stayed on campus, working at the university library that stayed open. It was lonely. I'm not going to lie, especially on Christmas, when I saw all my friends posting photos with their families. But it was also liberating in a way. I didn't have to deal with the drama, with the accusing looks, with the tense conversations. My parents blocked me on all social media at the beginning of January. They didn't send me a message or anything explaining why. One day I just tried to see my mom's profile on Facebook and discovered I couldn't access it anymore. I guess it was their way of making the no contact official. Hannah is also blocked. She's taking it harder than me, I think, because despite everything, she did have years of a close relationship with them, while I was always kind of distant. For her, it's like losing something she really had. For me, it's more like accepting that something I never fully had now definitely doesn't exist. I've been in therapy since October. The university offers free counseling services, and I decided to take advantage of them. My therapist has helped me process all this, to understand it wasn't my fault, that setting boundaries doesn't make me a bad person, that it's okay to prioritize my own future and well-being. She's also helped me deal with the guilt I still feel sometimes, especially about the Facebook post. Even though I deleted it, I know I hurt my parents with that, and I have to live with that decision. I'm not saying what I did was right, but I also don't think what they did was right either. Last week, Hannah sent me a photo of her with her new boyfriend. She looked happy, really happy, in a way I don't remember seeing her before. She wrote me that for the first time in her life she feels like she can be herself, without the pressure of being perfect all the time. She told me she thanked me for having the courage to set boundaries, because that gave her the courage to do the same. I guess that's enough for now. I don't know if I'll ever be able to reconcile with my parents. Part of me wishes it would happen. That someday they'd call and admit they were wrong, that they'd ask me for forgiveness. But another part of me has already made peace with the possibility that it'll never happen. And that's okay, I think. I've learned you can love your parents and still recognize they're not healthy people to have in your life. You can be grateful for the good things they gave you, while also accepting they hurt you in ways you didn't deserve. What I do know is that I gained a real sister in this whole process, and that's something I wouldn't trade for anything.